Hello everyone, this is Arafellan, and I am here in Secret of Mana because I'd like to talk a bit about how the landing system works for Flammie and, as it turns out, also Canon Travel. They share the same data. Now, I remember as a kid thinking that it should be a lot more granular than it turns out it actually is. For instance, especially in this earlier part of the game, there is so much detail on the ground. It's fairly close to what it actually is when you're wandering around in the field. Like, here in Pandora, we can see the city, we can see individual houses, the castle, the ruins to the south. So you'd think if you land at the ruins specifically, you should be at the ruins. But no, you end up in the middle of the town, just like you do for anywhere else in the region, or for the castle, or wherever. As it turns out, the game, as I probably should have realized because of how other games work, the world map has a 16 by 16 grid overlaid on it, and which cell of that grid you land in determines where you go when you land. Similar things are responsible for instance, I believe it's called the Peninsula of Power in Final Fantasy I, where you can encounter more powerful enemies early, getting head start on leveling up. Something similar in Final Fantasy IV north of Mount Ordeals, I believe. In any case, so there's this 16 by 16 grid overlaid on the world. Which cell of the grid you land in determines where you end up. And also, the ground is itself on a tile system, and each there's a 4 by 4 grid also overlaid on the map, and each sector of that has settings for which tiles you can and cannot land on. Now, for instance, basic grass tiles are landable anywhere. Forest tiles are not landable anywhere. There are a few that are different for which region you're on. For instance, if you try to land on the water temple itself here, you can't do that. You cannot land on these tiles in this area. But if I go over to the Wind Temple, this is in a different sector. In this sector, you can land on these tiles. Also in the Tree or Wood Palace Temple. In fact, when you first get to the Wood Palace, or Wood Temple, and when you go there after the continent has submerged again, that's the only place you can land there. So this is a standard copy of the game, no modifications made, and I just want to demonstrate while we're here two oddities of the landing system. One is if you come around this, I'm not exactly sure what it is, some kind of a mesa perhaps, but the southeasternmost one in the desert. If you land right around here, you land in the desert, everything looks normal for a bit, but then there is an immediate fade out and you're sent somewhere else. Now from here, if you go north, you'll see that you're right beneath, just south of Kakara Village, which is really nowhere near where I landed. So what's going on there? There is definitely something odd. I'll come back to this later in the video, but for now, remember that Canon Travel and Flammie landing data is shared. And also one characteristic of this grid is that if landing someplace sends to a specific place in the walkabout map, it always sends you to that same place. It's not dynamic. So if we come up to Ice Country here, you land at the village, you end up in the village. That makes sense. Take off again, we'll come out over the village, of course. Ice Country is actually surprisingly detailed as far as the landing zones go. There isn't that much walkable area in the Ice Country, but several of these, there are multiple grid cells that go to the same place, but they go to different locations on the same map, which is kind of surprising how detailed that is as far as landing zone differences go. But the oddity I wanted to show off here is that if I come out here to the west of the Ice Country, this cell here has landing data that perhaps the developers didn't realize you could actually use because it's pretty much all ocean. But if you come just to the westernmost tip of this island here, you can land on it, and you end up in the village again. Which, as I kind of demonstrated there, that's on the opposite side of the continent. It's all the way over here, and where I landed was over here on the far side. If you go even a little further west than where I landed, you'll end up in the resort town, which makes sense. So, I'm not sure, again, what happened there. Perhaps they were expecting you couldn't land there, and just never bothered to change it. Possibly it's a leftover from a different version of the map layout. I don't know, but the point is, this is a completely ordinary, unmodified copy of the game, and if you land out there on the westernmost tip of the mouth of the river, basically, you end up in the Sea Lion Village, which makes no sense. Now, to make things more interesting, I have a modified copy of the game that will let you land just about anywhere. So things get very interesting there. So here we are, this is my modified copy of the game where I have edited the landing data so it will let you land just about anywhere, including in the middle of the ocean. Now most areas do not have proper landing data defined, so if you land there you go to this weird black map with nothing on it, which then sends you immediately to outside the inn in Potos. I guess that's some kind of a default fail-safe thing. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the map is supposed to be or why it's there or anything, but in any case, most of the time, if you try to land someplace you can't actually land, that's where you end up. But things do get a little more interesting, so if I come here to the Upperland Forest, if I try to land, say, in the northeast section of this goes into the autumn area, which is indeed in the northeastern section of that map. If I instead try to land in the southwestern section, this comes to the spring area, which again is in the southwestern part of the map. So that makes sense. It's never used, but it makes sense. And unsurprisingly, if you try to land in the northwest, this takes you to the winter map. Now, this you cannot land on with Flammie normally, of course. However, it is not unused because, as I mentioned earlier, Flammie data is shared with canon travel data. And the canon does bring you here. Now, after that, you probably expect the southeastern part to take you to the summer part of the map, which would make sense. However, there's no landing data defined for the southeastern section. It just takes you back to that default landing spot, kicks you back to the Potos Inn. I have no idea why. If they bothered to define the other sections, they didn't also define that one. But that's the way it is. There are a few other interesting places, or potentially interesting, where you do have landing data defined where you wouldn't expect it. For instance, basically the entire northern half of the Imperial continent, if you land pretty much anywhere in here, except for a smallish area around the ruins themselves, you'll end up in Northtown. So if I come all the way out to the eastern edge of the continent and land here, this puts me in the middle of Northtown, just as though I'd landed in Northtown itself. And like I said, pretty much the entire northern half of the continent is just all landing zones that go to Northtown. The same is not true for the southern half. The southern half, only the cell with Southtown itself goes to Southtown, and then the cell with the cannon next to it goes to the cannon next to it. The rest of it has nothing defined. But again, the northern half pretty much everywhere does go to Northtown, which kind of suggests that you were supposed to be able to explore more of that area, but it didn't make it into the final game, which was significantly trimmed down at some point to get things to fit when the CD add-on didn't end up happening. Another interesting place is if you come here to the mountains and try to land at this tree here, which I always thought looked like you should be able to land in. This is not normally a landable spot, but if you land in this sector... Okay, there we go. I didn't make all of those landable, apparently. But yes, if you land in this cell, you end up pretty much near the peak of the mountain, very close to the Sage's Cave. If I just switch to the whip and go across here. the cave is just right up here. You're one whip away from it, pretty much already there. So, I kind of get the impression, going back through the story, that you weren't really meant to be able to fly when you first got here. It seems like you were kind of supposed to climb up the mountain from the bottom, but in the interest of, time and space and all that, they kind of compressed the game a bit, compressed the storyline, gave you flying early, so ended up taking out that landing zone so that you couldn't just come up here every time you wanted to visit the stage. Another thing you may notice is if you look at the background actually displayed properly when I landed there, where you could see both the sky and the land beneath it. I guess the exploder is interfering with the whip effect. Anyway, like I was saying, when you come out of the cave at the top, you see just sky. When you enter from the bottom, coming up the mountain, you see just the land. But when you land at that particular spot where you can't actually land normally, the background displays properly, showing you both the sky and the land, which is kind of interesting. Not particularly meaningful, but it is kind of interesting. So there are two other particularly odd places you can't normally land that I want to show off. One is, if you come to the Wood Temple, the Lost Continent, come to the southeast of it, in the very southeast corner of the world map, land out in the middle of the ocean, there is a landing zone here that takes you to the Mana Fortress, but not exactly. It kind of drops you in some weird spot off to the side, and because this is the part of the game before getting the barrier dispelled, you can't land there anyway. What's more interesting is if you come to the Mana Holyland, the Pureland here, the center, of course, when you can land there, takes you into the Pureland, but south of this, there is a landing zone, which takes you directly to the Mana Fortress, and actually lands you on the fortress itself. Again, because this is before the part of the storyline where you're able to land there, nothing actually happens, except you get kicked back out. But what happens if we advance the game to when you can land there? This is after going through and all the events there. This is the end game. I could land on the Mana Fortress directly now, but if I come back and land in the same spot, Flammie flies in, drops us off there, and we're just on the Mana Fortress. I suspect that what's going on there is this apparently unused, normally unreachable landing zone is used internally by the game for landing on the fortress. But what about that other one that was kind of off in the corner of the world? I'll just head back there and try landing there now and see what happens. Again, if anytime you take off from the Mana Fortress with Flammie, it will always put you in this same spot, south and slightly east of this continent. So line up from here, goes southeast, should be right around here. Yep, here we go. Maybe he's coming for a landing, but he misses the fortress entirely. We're kind of stuck somewhere off in the middle of nowhere. It can't walk around, can't use weapons, can't run. You can see the energy meter moving as though I'm attacking, but you can't hear the weapon, you can't see anything. If I try to go in the menu, it kind of doesn't behave properly. I can get the Flammie drum to work and get out of here, but that's about it. So this seems like it's possibly the remnants of some kind of testing thing that was never completely removed. In any case, it's kind of odd. I did promise I would come back to this, the area outside Kakara, out in the desert. This weird spot where you land here, you get sent somewhere else immediately. This may look familiar from earlier in the game. When you first try to travel to the desert by cannon, you get sent to this special area where, after waiting around for a little while, or more easily if you just go in a little loop from there, you end up finding the sand ship, and there's some events that go on there. This is a modified save where I kind of played with the event flags and to get further into the game than would normally be for playing around with things. So, the sandship events never happen on this save, the flags aren't set, and so all this stuff is happening when you land there. So, yes, that specific landing zone is used for cannon travel when you're going to the desert for the first time to get the sandship events to occur. And as I mentioned, the game is not set up to change where a landing spot lands you. So if you come back there later in the game after the sandship events have already happened, the game checks these events flags, sees that this has all happened already, and it just sends you directly to Kakara, just outside of the city. Village, whatever you want to call it. So you have kind of that awkward transition where you land in the sandship area, but then you're immediately sent away from it because you're not supposed to be there anymore. It's kind of weird and awkward, but that's just the way the game works. But wait, you may be saying, what about the Wood Palace and the Mana Holyland, the Pureland? If you land here, when the continent is not risen, you get to this spot where there's just a little coral island, no big temple rising out of the ground, none of that stuff. But if you land here when the continent is sticking out of the ground, same spot, same quadrant, there's this whole big structure sticking out of the ground here. You can climb down, go into the ancient city and all that. This isn't the same place, is it? It turns out it is the same place. The game does some drastic manipulation of what the tiles are and where you can go and all that, but it is actually the same map, exactly the same place, just drastically modified on the fly, depending on which stage of the game you're currently in. Similarly, and even more dramatically, if you come to the Mana Holyland before going through it, you land at the entrance, there's a bunch of woods to go through and all the bosses and stuff. But if you come back after the events there, you're just at the remains of the mana tree, and the whole dungeon is not accessible anymore, and all that. This looks even less like it should be the same map, but it actually is. It's kind of amazing that the game is able to modify the area that drastically, but that's exactly what it does to make this work. You'd think it would be easier to put some kind of dynamic changing effect into the landing data itself so that it would go to two different maps, but that's not the way the game does it. I'm not sure why, but hey, in the end it works out. It's a very effective illusion. And yeah. So this has been Arafel demonstrating how landing zones work in Secret of Mana, and some oddities that you'll never actually see in the normal game unless you're playing around with flags and how things work and let yourself land where you can't. So yeah, hope you enjoyed it.